As soon as I see okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are, to some 350 people who have registered for this event. I'm Eric Schwartz, chair of the Humphrey School of Public Affairs Global Policy Area at the University of Minnesota. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this meeting on the Minnesota Truth Council and lessons from global practice. The abuses to which Minnesotans were subjected through Operation Metro Surge and Operation Paris were matched by the countless examples of community solidarity and resilience and resistance. And the Truth Council is part of the effort at both healing and accountability. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Barb Fry for initially conceiving of this event. I want to thank Lisa Marshall, Val Horton, and Sophia Johnson of the Humphrey School for their terrific work in supporting this event. And I want to thank the co-sponsoring units, the Law School's Binger Center for New Americans and its Human Rights Center, the College of Liberal Arts Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, its Human Rights Program, and the College of Liberal Arts' Immigration History Research Center. And finally, the Humphrey School's Global Policy Program and its Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy. And the range of organizations represents how deeply and how broadly concerns here are at the university about what went on beginning in December. But I'm now thrilled to announce our two keynote speakers who will offer opening remarks. And then we will follow with a short discussion drawn from questions you should feel free to provide. Our first speaker will be Bernard Duhem, the UN Special Rapporteur on Truth, Justice, and Reparations. He is a full professor of international law at the University of Quebec in Montreal. He's also a senior fellow at the Columbia Law School Human Rights Institute and a visiting professor at the University of Paris. We'll then hear, I hope, because I'm not sure she's arrived yet, we will then hear from Samantha Power, the Anna Lind Professor of the Practice of Global Leadership and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, the William D. Zabel 61 Professor of Practice in Human Rights at the Law School. She's author of A Problem from Hell, among other books dealing with critical human rights issues, as well as the former aid administrator, U.S. aid administrator, and UN ambassador, and my former colleague. So with that, Bernard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, dear colleagues. I hope you can hear me adequately. You can hear me well?
I can certainly hear you. I hope others can as well.
Very good, thank you. So I will start. My name is Bernard Duhem, and I'm the current UN Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence. I would like to begin by thanking the Humphrey School's Global Policy Program for inviting me to speak at this very important event. I applaud you for your efforts to facilitate such a crucial discussion on the function and impact of truth commissions. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share some perspectives on the right to truth in global practice and transitional justice processes. The purpose of the Special Rapporteur mandate is to ensure accountability, serve justice, and promote truth and memory about past violations while providing remedies to victims. This is accomplished through reforming national, institutional, and legal frameworks to promote the rule of law in accordance with international human rights standards, with the ultimate goal of preventing the recurrence of crisis and future violence. My mandate is based on 5 central pillars: the right to truth of victims, their right to access justice, their right to access and obtain reparation, including restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition, the pillar of memorialization, without which the right to truth, justice, and reparation will not be fulfilled, and of course, the obligation of non-recurrence to ensure that past violations are not repeated, and that strategies that are adapted to undertake institutional reforms and other measures necessary to ensure the respect for the rule of law and to foster and maintain a culture of respect for human rights and to restore the confidence in government institutions. Last month, along with a group of my fellow human rights experts, we welcomed the announcement of a Minnesota truth-seeking entity. We supported the establishment of a process to document and report serious human rights violations allegedly committed in Minnesota by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and Custom and Border Protection, CBP, agents during Operation Metro Surge and Operation Paris. Additionally, we urged a nationwide investigation to commence. Between December 2025 and February 2026, ICE and PCP officers allegedly shot at close range and killed two US citizens who were defending the rights of migrants, used excessive force against individuals believed to be undocumented, and targeted peaceful protesters, human rights defenders, and bystanders. The operations reportedly relied on racial profiling and lacked judicial warrants, and false accusations of domestic terrorism were also made. In any democracy rooted in the rule of law, such violations must never be ignored or left unaddressed. I commend the authorities in Minnesota for acting swiftly to establish a process to document, record, and report on the violations, the new Minnesota Truth Council. It is admirable that the Council aims to provide a safe forum for victims and community members to share their stories and will operate under the principles of independence, impartiality, transparency, and victim-centered inquiry. It's important that its findings and recommendations will be distinct from and without prejudice to any ongoing or future legal proceedings. The initiative will help reveal the harm inflicted and the circumstances and responsibilities that led to it. It will be critical to provide redress to victims and healing to the community. The United States of America, across federal, state, and local levels, have a binding duty under international law to document and conduct prompt, effective, and independent investigations into grave human rights violations committed by its agents. This is also necessary to be in compliance with the globally recognized Minnesota Protocol on the investigation of potentially unlawful deaths, as well as other international standards similar applicable to truth-seeking processes, with a view to holding those responsible to account and ensuring non-recurrence. The creation of the Council is a decisive step forward in that direction. The practice of truth-seeking must be done with appropriate participation of victims in the proceedings through wide-ranging possibilities of being heard. Formally, states must be deliberate and systematic in the creation and operation of truth commissions and commissions of inquiry, mechanisms created specifically to establish the facts surrounding heinous crimes perpetrated on a massive or systematic basis against societies. The views of the victims and survivors should be central to these decisions, which should also take into consideration gender equity and civil society representation. Truth commissions should operate with independence, impartiality, competence, and effectiveness. States must take the measures necessary to ensure the independence and effective operation of non-judicial truth-seeking processes. These include transparent funding, the assistance of law enforcement authorities, and the selection of commission members who are persons of high moral character, neutrality, and integrity. Investigations by truth commissions or any proceeding that could affect people's rights must comply with the basic guarantees of due process. After truth commissions conclude their work, the dissemination of the information gathered and the preservation of its archives must be prioritized. States have a duty to preserve archives and other evidence concerning past violations to facilitate access to knowledge by members of the public. Commission reports should be made public in full and disseminated as widely as possible. For security reasons, portions of inquiries may sometimes be kept confidential if, for example, disclosure could cause further harm to or threaten the safety and interests of victims. I would like to stress that a victim-centered approach should be central to the work carried out to develop and implement transitional justice measures. An immediate goal of transitional justice is redressing the harm to victims. Furthermore, transitional justice processes themselves rely on victims' participation. Truth commissions, for example, depend on the participation of victims in statement-taking exercises. Therefore, a victim-centered approach is not only critical because redressing the harm is an immediate goal of transitional justice measures, but also because none of this can happen on the backs of victims without their full and meaningful effective participation. In thinking about the important contributions that victims can make to transitional justice measures, it's crucial not to obscure the fact that participation also imposes burdens. Participation in transitional justice measures can involve security risks, social risks, including stigmatization and isolation, economic costs, and the risk of re-traumatization, amongst others. Ignoring risks when designing participatory processes would be tantamount to the instrumentalization of victims. Indeed, victims must know the full truth about the violations, receive comprehensive reparation, and be protected from further violence or retaliation. As UN experts, we encourage authorities in all relevant jurisdictions to conduct investigations into any human rights violations committed by state agents. In the current context, I urge federal authorities to cooperate with criminal investigations by providing access to crime scene evidence and to other relevant information. I am interested and ready to provide technical assistance where needed to accompany federal and state authorities in their efforts to adopt transitional justice measures that comply with the above mentioned standards and obligations. Our mandate has produced specific reports that offer advice and guidance on applying transitional justice principles. These reports can be consulted on the mandate website, and I am happy to discuss these issues in depth with any authorities that might be interested. I would like to conclude by thanking once again the organizers and all of you for being here today and for engaging in these important conversations. I welcome the establishment of a process to document and report serious human rights violations, documenting, seeking the truth, and ensuring accountability for human rights violations. This is not optional. It is a legal obligation and a prerequisite for justice and guarantees of non-repetition. Finally, I would like to express my utmost respect to victims and their families and recall that they must always be at the center of all efforts to address a violent past and build a future of peace and respect for human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernard, for your comments, which were very insightful and will be extremely useful to us. I'm now thrilled to introduce my former colleague. Samantha, you may have missed what I hope was a generous introduction of you, so I
I
won't
heard it.
repeat it.
I was here. I was just in the audience, not
Oh,
in
terrific,
as a
terrific.
panelist.
Okay, and so Samantha, the floor is yours, and welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be part of this conversation. I want to start by thanking our host, Eric Schwartz, one of the most dedicated and effective public servants that I've ever had the chance to work with. This is vintage you, Eric, pulling this together and gathering such a distinguished launch here today. I also want to thank the Humphrey School and the many human rights institutions across the University of Minnesota that have come together to sponsor this event. Your collective commitment reflects an enduring belief in the dignity of every person and believing in the dignity of every person entails a belief in truth and in justice. And I think that's what all of this speaks to. The commitment to dignity at the heart of this is not surprising when one considers the extraordinary legacy of this institution and the legacy of the state of Minnesota. Hubert Humphrey, Harold Stassen, Eleanor Anderson, Roy Wilkins, Don Fraser, Walter Mondale, Josie Johnson, so many incredible Minnesotans who have long been part of movements to try to secure the realization of civil rights and the rule of law. In recent months, those of us not from Minnesota who have been watching from outside of Minnesota were horrified as reports emerged about actions taken by federal authorities, by ICE and CBP specifically. Their operations tore families apart. Their officers, often masked, detained individuals who were in the United States lawfully. They subjected countless men, women, and children to inhumane mistreatment, forced transfers, and they were part of operations that resulted in outright deportation. But alongside that horror came something else, something that probably did not surprise Minnesotans, but really struck the rest of us from far away, an incredible show of solidarity. People from different backgrounds and political perspectives from across the Twin Cities and across Minnesota came together. They recognized the injustice that was unfolding, and they understood their responsibility to one another. You Minnesotans have become famous around the country and the world for turning neighboring to neighbor into a verb. You opened your homes and your wallets. You raised your voices in protest clearly, consistently, and courageously. You drove someone else's daughter to school because her parents were too afraid of ICE to leave their homes. You spent money in neighborhood restaurants where workers and customers were steering clear because you wanted to do your part to try to make sure those businesses stayed afloat. And you introduced us to the modern weapons of resistance, cell phone cameras and whistles. You did this often at significant personal risk. As the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy so painfully remind us, risk came at the highest possible cost. Minnesotans deserve justice. And justice, if it is to be meaningful, if it is to be enduring, has to include truth. This effort, your effort, is especially vital at a time when our world is experiencing the 20th consecutive year of freedom in decline. Around the planet, we are seeing the erosion of democratic norms, the weakening of institutions, and a growing willingness by those in power to obscure or distort the truth. We are actually seeing an epidemic of impunity. In that context, establishing a historical record and reckoning, as you are, with lawlessness and injustice, that takes on even greater importance. Facts and evidence stand as a bulwark against amnesia and denial, reinforcing the principle that no society can sustain the rule of law and the rights of its people if it is unwilling to confront its own abuses. By committing to a truth process in Minnesota, you are not only seeking justice for your communities, you are contributing to the defense of democratic values at a moment when they are under sustained pressure worldwide. You are, again, an exemplar. In my own work, whether as a journalist covering war zones a long time ago, or later in government engaging with countries emerging from conflict, I have seen the importance of truth-telling processes up close. They are never easy. They require courage from the victims and survivors. They require humility from institutions, and they require persistence from civil society and citizens. These processes, which again are never easy to orchestrate, help ratify the dignity of those who have been harmed. They create space for stories that might otherwise go unheard. And they help communities begin to heal by confronting what happened honestly, but also the Minnesota way collectively. In Minnesota, a truth process will go even further. Beyond what it does for your communities, for the people of your state, it will increase the likelihood that the broader American public understands what happened there, not in abstract terms, but in distinctly human ones. The stories that emerge from this process will help illuminate the real cost of injustice, and it will illuminate the vital need in all of our communities, in all of our countries, and all around the world to combat impunity. The creation of the Minnesota Truth Council is a significant event for Minnesota, for the United States, and for the world. It reflects a recognition that moving forward requires looking back. It signals a commitment not just to respond to injustice, but to learn from it. And it offers a model that others may one day embrace as they confront their own challenges. So I want to close by offering my congratulations to the organizers of this council, to the institutions supporting it, and to the people of Minnesota who have inspired so many. Your actions over the past months have demonstrated what it means to stand up for one another. This next step of building a process of truth is an equally powerful act of leadership, because ultimately, the pursuit of truth and justice anywhere strengthens the cause of democracy everywhere. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both for such wonderful and complimentary sets of comments. I'm looking at our clock, and so I think we have time for one question for each of you. And it's the same question, and it's drawn from an audience question, which I've been thinking about as well, which is, what tools do Minnesotans have, and do supporters of this Truth Council have at their disposal when we know that the federal government response to this council is going to be unremittingly hostile? I mean, that's not really an issue for discussion. And so under those circumstances, whether it's I don't want to answer the question while I'm asking it. So what tools are there? And maybe I'll start with Samantha and then move to Bernard, and then we'll let you go on to do all the other important things that will occupy your day.
Thank you. Well, Eric, I was smiling because I think you are a font of wisdom on your question, and I'd like to hear how you lead the witness and what your answers are. But first of all, don't underestimate the good that will be done by giving voice to people who witnessed grave horrors right before their eyes, things they never thought they would see in the streets or even in the homes of Minnesotans. And so we don't need to diminish just what providing that platform, that respect, that recognition. I mentioned in my comments that a lot of the individuals involved with significant brutality were wearing masks. Implicit in that is somehow this idea that we know from past history, which is, people won't remember, people will forget, no one will know. Somehow that you can obscure the facts of what happened. And so that validation, that legitimation of those voices is a hugely significant act. But the second thing I would say that I think we learned from other cases, I'd be interested, Bernard is the true specialist here, but life is long. What today may well be unremitting hostility from the institutions that put these often masked, mostly men who were armed and often very, very dangerous in our communities. That hostility today may give way to something very different in the future. The old baseball movie, if you build it, they will come. You just don't, again, if you start the clock and stop the clock over the course of a day, over the course of the next couple of months, you're right that getting the buy-in from the federal government that put Minnesotans in this excruciatingly difficult situation, dangerous situation, that we're not going to see the kind of cooperation that we'd like to see. But we have seen globally analogous hostility give way to democratic transition, give way to things like the equivalent in our system of congressional subpoenas. That's not something the Truth Council, of course, has at its disposal, but we have elections in this country. Who has the gavel in various committees may well change one day soon. That may bring forward witnesses who have to speak to the events of what happened. That in turn may become relevant for the proceedings that you all are launching. So I think politics is one answer. I think enlisting those you can enlist, because not everybody who was involved in what happened wants to be complicit in what happened, and so you never know whether you can pry apart some of the institutions that seem hostile. There are also law enforcement institutions from within Minnesota who had visibility and may know things that can be brought forward. But also, again, remembering that what is the current lay of the land can get scrambled pretty quickly, and that can inject a new vitality and a new set of facts into your process.
Eric, I think you're
Yeah, I
on.
am. Thank you for that, Samantha. Bernard.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the question. Um, I'm going to follow Samantha's wisdom. Um, Firstly, I would say that it's important to listen to the victims, and the victims have the right to be heard and to be taken seriously. The attitude of authorities often is to neglect their position, to reject their testimony, their point of views. Throughout my work at the UN as current special rapporteur, or previously as member of the UN Working Group on Enforced Disappearances, often women victims and women witnesses are often also the object of harassment in these contexts and are not taken seriously. And these processes of truth telling and similar institutions, such as the Working Group on Enforced Disappearances or other UN institutions, are one venue where they are taken seriously, where they are listened to, where they are given credibility, and where they are also treated humanly. So if the Truth Council does its work in accordance with international standards, and I'm confident they will, the victims will be heard and their position will be on record. That's the first point. The second point, and again following Samantha's comments, is that it's on record, and records stay, and record outlive politics. Records outlive governments. Records outlive trends. You know, human rights is not a trend that we follow one decade and then neglect the next one. It's not a pendulum that comes and goes. It's an ongoing march towards humanity, towards dignity of individuals, towards the rule of law, and towards democracy. It's never over. It's an ongoing process, and eventually we look back at those records and we make good of them. We make good for victims. We ensure that the truth is transmitted to generations. We make reparations to those victims. We make justice so that people account for the crimes that they commit. And also, we build on this truth to prevent that violence and unacceptable crimes like this do not repeat themselves. So this is crucial. I have so many times seen how records that were brought before the UN and kept with the UN during witness testimonies and so forth, whether now as special rapporteur or before as member of the working group on disappearances, were later used in different other fora, including criminal proceedings, because it was on record. And the authorities could no longer say that this never happened because it was on record. Now, I have been in several countries where state authorities were sometimes reluctant or did an incomplete work at establishing the truth for all sorts of reasons, because of a political context, because of the circumstances that made it complicated, and so forth. I just did a country visit to Brazil last year where there was a truth commission established, but did only one aspect of the narrative, only one aspect of the truth telling exercise. And what's interesting is that federated states, so provinces or the equivalent of the federated states, took the initiative of making this truth telling exercise to complete the narrative. And years later, when we revisit this process, we take into consideration these narratives that were established, these truth telling exercises in provinces, in federated states that allow to revisit the record and make sure that it's complete and that the whole truth is told about what has occurred. So I'm confident that the record that will be established by the Truth Council in Minnesota will serve in a broader exercise of truth telling. I really hope for all Americans that this will be followed as an example, and I encourage all authorities to follow suit to make sure that truth, justice, reparation, and memory, as well as guarantees of non-recurrence, is ensured. I truly apologize. I'm greatly honored to participate in this event. Unfortunately, I'm very far away in another time zone and I need to attend to some other important engagements. But I want to congratulate all of you on this very important event. And I wish you all the best. And of course, all the best to the Truth Council. And I reiterate my solidarity with the victims. Thank you very much.
Stay long enough so I can thank you. I want to thank Bernard Duhem and Samantha Power for really wonderful opening comments. And I don't really know how to applaud on a webinar, but if I could, I would. And so thank you so much. We're so very grateful. And now, only 15 minutes behind schedule after our first event, we're doing just as I would have expected. So I'm going to turn to my two colleagues, Christina Ewig, who runs our Center for Women, Gender, and Public Policy, and Carrie Walling, who leads the Human Rights Program at the university. But we'll start with Christina, and then Carrie will take us to the end. So, Christina, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Eric. And thanks to everybody who's joined us today. I know we have a great number of folks in the audience and really a wonderful lineup of panelists in this first session. The title of this first session is Truth Commissions, Goals, Structure, and Outcomes. I'm Christina Ewig. I'm Professor of Public Affairs at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and Director of the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy here at the Humphrey School. Truth Commissions is something that I've have some familiarity with. I followed very closely the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission when that took place. And now I'm engaged in a project that is attempting to bring Indigenous women's perspectives and voices into the Colombian transitional justice process. So this is something of deep intellectual interest for me, but also as a Minnesotan, something that is really important to me, that the Minnesota Truth Council succeed in its objectives, as so many of my neighbors, friends, and students were deeply impacted by Operation Metro Surge, and it continues to be a critical issue here in Minnesota. So this panel, we are interested specifically in what's being called the Minnesota Truth Council, or the full name, the Governor's Council on Recording the Truth of Operation Metro Surge and Operation Paris, and thinking about and learning about what the process will be for the Minnesota Truth Council, and what lessons might be learned from truth commissions from around the world and the deep experience that many people in this session today and around the world have on those commissions. So what I will be doing is moderating a panel of esteemed experts. I'm going to be introducing them one by one, have them present for about 5 minutes each. And as they present, I encourage audience members to post questions in the Q&A. Following their presentations, I will moderate those questions and we will have a discussion with the panelists. So we're going to begin with Alexis Claire Rorick, who is director of the Minnesota Truth Council, as well as policy advisor to the office of Governor Tim Walz and Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. I think Ms. Rorick brings incredible expertise to this position because prior to serving as policy advisor to the office of the governor, she was the acting policy director of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, which is a civil society organization composed of business and nonprofits based in Washington, D.C., that advocates for U.S. international affairs. And she also, prior to that, worked internationally for several years in Africa, working with farmers in Africa. So she brings experience in diplomacy and foreign policy, and that I think is really valuable for her new charge on the as directing the Minnesota Truth Council. So I'm going to hand it to Ms. Rorick to start off our conversation.
Hi, thank you. Appreciate that introduction, and I'm very grateful to be participating in this webinar today, and very grateful to be in the position to be supporting the Minnesota Truth Council on behalf of the governor's office. I'm going to give a little bit more of the nuts and bolts, the lay of the land of what the Minnesota Truth Council is made up of, and the intent behind the governor's executive order. I am first and foremost grateful to Governor Tim Walz for his leadership. Early on, when we were feeling the acute impacts of Operation Metro Surge in Paris, he called this out right away, that we will need to make sure that Minnesotans are able to tell their story, they're able to be heard, documented, that these stories are able to be shared. And that this council will make sure that we are documenting that history. So without him, of course, we wouldn't be in this position, and I'm very grateful that he is leading in this way. Specifically, on March 25th, the governor signed the executive order to establish the Minnesota Truth Council, and the goal being an independent, nonpartisan body composed of leaders from across Minnesota with a range of expertise and perspectives. The council's goals to document the impacts of Operation Metro Surge in Paris, and this is really twofold. It's both the harm that has been done, but also the unity and the incredible ability for Minnesotans to come together and support each other during this incredibly trying time. And to ensure that people's experiences are preserved and heard, like we heard from Bernard and Samantha. And then finally, to make recommendations to prevent future harm and support the state's long-term recovery. So the infrastructure to do that, first and foremost, includes the council members. So the makeup for here is 15 members. 3 are direct appointments. That includes the chair. Our vice chair, which is held by our key partner, the Advocates for Human Rights. And then the other appointed position is another key partner, the ACLU of Minnesota. The remaining 12 positions are open appointments. And we, in the executive order, deemed a few categories to help guide the selection, including immigration, civil and human rights experts, education, law enforcement, faith and religion, business, health, and community impact. Thinking about all the different ways and avenues and expertise that could contribute to the council's makeup. After extensive strategic outreach through agencies, legislators, both at the state and federal level, universities, community organizations, we have received 139 applications for the council. We've met the 21-day minimum set out by the Secretary of State and by statute, and we're in the process of reviewing all of those applications. I personally have read all 139 resumes and cover letters, and it has been honestly some of the most moving experience thus far. The stories told in these cover letters are truly motivating to continue to put in every hour of work that we can towards this council. We will have that council, the members in place in May. And speaking of the applicants, the range has also just been incredibly moving. From immigration, civil rights, education, law enforcement experts, to lawyers, reverends, bus drivers, moms who organize neighborhood watches, UN human rights experts, doctors, veterans, agriculture leaders. It's just truly a representation of the communities who were impacted and who came together to respond. Our key partner is the Advocates for Human Rights. We are very fortunate to be joined today by Michelle, so I won't steal any of her thunder by speaking but their work. But they will be leading a robust process to collect the stories, to be engaging with the community and collecting those statements. And they'll work very closely with the council to prepare that for the public meetings and the report. So the council's responsibilities, they have 4 public meetings that they'll hold this year, and they'll be hearing statements and testimony collected via the advocates. They will also hear quantitative impacts that our state agencies are collecting and analyzing. Everything from reduction in sales to the need for emergency rental assistance to increased absences in child and care in schools and tourism. So really looking at the quantitative impacts in addition to the statements taken. Our final report will be due out in December, and it will reflect the findings as well as the recommendations to prevent the reoccurrence of harm. As our opener said, this council itself it's not a court. It's not a method for prosecuting or convicting. It doesn't have a law enforcement role, but it does have the role of collecting the truth and making sure that that record is held, and that those voices of those who are harmed are heard. I think the thing I want to close with for my section is just thinking about the ways in which everyone can engage. You can participate in sharing the stories, the statements, and the impacts, attending the public meetings, volunteering your time. I've had individuals from archivists to a stenographer to reach out and say, I want to help. Is there something I can do? Giving feedback throughout the process, and including thinking about the recommendations that come out at the end, and then really helping to implement those solutions after. That's something we've been thinking about deeply, is how do we keep this work moving forward, especially with the governor's term ending in January. We want to make sure that the report and the findings and the voices live on. And so I'll close with saying, as the governor has said, this council will make sure that we document Minnesota's history, but we're going to need your help doing so. So I look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Rorick. Now we will go to Sarah Lopez, who is Policy Director at Unidos, Minnesota. For those of you not familiar, Unidos is a grassroots organization that fights for social, racial, and economic justice. It has strong immigration, education, and climate campaigns. Ms. Lopez was previously a senior advisor to Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, and she was also a policy fellow at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and currently pursuing a master's in public policy at the Humphrey School. Unidos is really a key organization, certainly during Operation Metro Surge. It led the Monarca Collective, with Monarca having helped to train over 50,000 upstanders, folks that stood up during Metro Surge. Unidos has been at the forefront of providing both support to individuals detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement and mobilizing civil society to defend constitutional rights. So we've heard that the Minnesota Truth Council will be collecting stories and evidence of the operations of immigration enforcement. And of course, we want to hear from you, Ms. Lopez, about how you view that as someone who's been engaged in the community. And what are the risks and what are the advantages that you see of the Minnesota Truth Council?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Hello, my name is Sarah Lopez. I'm policy director at Unidos, Minnesota, and I'm filling in today for the extraordinary Emilia Gonzalez Avalos, who was unable to join us today. And I feel like it's very important to ground us in the current context as we are here to talk about the truth. And our current context is that as we gather our bearings in the aftermath of Paris and Metro Surge, we begin Tuesday yet again with the deployment of a fraud narrative. And in this moment where we are here to talk about the truth, we start with 22 childcare sites raided by the FBI in the name of like fraud and abuse and waste. And what we are seeing is that the beast is showing us that it's still lurking around, and the tactics are just more insidious and gradually spread because they're built in generations of division amongst Americans and the intention to erode credibility in our institutions and make people fearful of our neighbors. In a very hyper local context, and for folks who are not with us in the state, it shows that we need the truth and we need a process to continue sharing the impacts on community because Minnesota is still a testing ground. In this moment at the Minnesota legislature today, right as this narrative is being deployed, childcare fraud hearings are scheduled. And we're entering the final negotiations for policies like rental relief, small business relief, and some provisions to keep federal agents away from schools, daycares, and childcares. So the question in front of us in this context is, as we engage in conversations around truth councils, is also how do we interrupt this democratic backsliding? And we know that a truth council is an incredibly important mechanism to produce that accountability and historical record. Some of them, and most of them, come after democratic collapse, and some of them arrive too late or are not accessible or pluralistic enough, and somehow some of them are not able to prevent civil rights erosions. But in Minnesota, we believe that our situation is pretty distinct and different. The question is not whether authoritarian consolidation has already occurred, but whether institutional safeguards are activated early enough to prevent that outcome. In our state, we're still under attack. This morning has shown that we're still very much under attack, but we remain highly functional. And most importantly, everyday citizens remain highly engaged. There were patrollers out there in some of these sites doing legal observing. And this is because of years of investment in the work of organizing and leadership development by many organizations. So Minnesotans again and again understand that we cannot afford to sit down and wait to lose more structural ground to federal attacks. And I understand there are questions about whether folks might be fearful about sharing their story or getting involved in a more formal process like a truth council. But this is where the frame of organizing is key, because organizing is a process that's rooted in agency. We don't tell people what to do. We run people through a self-determination process. And we wrestle with choices to make, like, am I ready to speak up and share my story in the Truth Council? Or just this morning, we have Minnesotans wrestling with choices like, am I ready and willing to document and observe? Am I going to peacefully attempt to delay an operation, or am I going to disrupt or not? Am I ready to stand witness? I will say that Minnesota has what I call a super strong courage and self-determination blueprint. And for example, and this is the groundwork for this, some of this happened during the summer of 2020, where mutual aid networks with real relationships were formed from existing historical memory of the pandemic and the movement for Black lives. And in terms of expectations from our community, participation and self-determination are key. The trifecta of 2023, 2024 showed us that people are incredibly courageous, and those who had the most to lose still showed up at the Capitol for driver's license, to access to healthcare. So regular everyday people know in Minnesota, thanks to all the organizing infrastructure that we already have, that democratic institutions can actually change conditions and are worth protecting. And I feel like at Unidos Minnesota, we have our work cut out for us, and we're clear that the next step is completely and fully delving into the defense of democracy, reorienting our work and our networks into democracy protection and truth telling. We have our launch this Friday, which will have hundreds of people ready to engage in a very pluralistic process that keeps people at the center, that gives people an opportunity to step up and participate. Because for us, the choice is pretty stark. Do we do business as usual, or do we invest in early in the planning, alignment, and preparation to protect our democracy? And key and foundational for that is the exercise of telling the truth to protect and to safeguard as an exercise. The truth tells us that we belong to one another. The truth tells us that we belong here, that we are for here, and that Minnesota is a place where we have the opportunity to make it better for everybody. Thank you so much for for giving me the opportunity to participate. Is an honor to be here with you all, and I'm just thrilled about the opportunity to tell the truth and be on this right side of history.
Sarah, thank you so much for your comments. We are now going to go to a prepared video from Faculty Director of the Human Rights Center and Regents Professor and Robina Chair in Law, Public Policy and Society at the University of Minnesota, Professor Fionnuala Ní Oileáin. Professor Ní Oileáin most recently was appointed as a commissioner to the United Nations Independent Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic. Many of you may know of her work between 2017 and 2023, in which she served as United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Most recently, she was appointed to the Council of State of Ireland by President Catherine Connolly. She is also a professor of law at Queen's University of Belfast. That is just a small bit of Professor Ní Oileáin's background, and we are pleased because she is currently in Morocco without a great internet connection. She has a prepared video for us.
We
Bear with us as we're working to get some sound for you on that video. Due to running a bit over time, we won't have a lot of time for questions, just giving folks a heads up on that. But I am taking a look at them in the chat. Some really interesting questions here.
I cannot hear it. I wonder whether we can, if others cannot, I wonder whether we might give it a try after the next speaker, if that might be possible.
Yeah, let's give that a try. And this will give us a chance to hear from Michelle Garnett McKenzie, who is Executive Director of Advocates for Human Rights. Heard Ms. Rorick talk about the Minnesota Truth Council and how a key partner with the council is the Advocates for Human Rights. The Advocates were founded in 1983, and they seek to implement human rights standards both at home and abroad. Ms. Garnett McKenzie is an attorney that's represented detained immigrants. She served in the Human Trafficking Task Force and chaired the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault Public Policy Committee. Ms. Garrett McKenzie, tell us a bit about your expectations about the structure and goals for the Minnesota Truth Council.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Eric, for letting us convening this all and letting us have a chance to really come together for a reflection on how this process both fits into Minnesota's story and into the world's story, because we do all have a story to tell and we all have truth to tell. I'll start just by saying, the Advocates for Human Rights, as you mentioned, Christina, as an independent, nonpartisan, multi-issue, volunteer-driven human rights organization. We're rooted here in our home community of Minnesota, but we work in partnerships here and around the globe to advance the human rights of migrants, women, LGBTIQ plus persons, and to abolish the death penalty worldwide. But we've also worked pretty deeply on some of the things that are most front and center in this truth-telling process right now. Our work has included providing free immigration legal help, developing strong legal standards. You heard the Special Rapporteur mention the Minnesota Protocol on the Investigation of Potentially Unlawful Death, which the Minnesota Protocol was one of the Advocates for Human Rights' first projects back in the 1980s. And most relevant in supporting truth-telling processes for Minnesotans and for people around the globe. Back several decades ago, we held mock trials of the Khmer Rouge, engaging victims of that genocide in telling their truth, providing testimony that later formed testimony in the extraordinary court that held people criminally accountable. We provided on-the-ground support in Peru and Sierra Leone's transitional justice processes, and we served for many years as the operational partner of the Liberian Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work in the diaspora. We'll be bringing all of this experience to Minnesota's Truth Council process. The truth-seeking process here really is at the vanguard of those processes seeking to prevent the backsliding of democratic institutions. You've heard about that from others today already. We are not through and at the end of a period of political violence. We are in the midst of the backsliding of democratic institutions, and truth-telling can help us in preventing that backsliding. It is only one process, but it is an important one. And like Minnesota, we are anticipating that this process will be unique. It will bring all of the Minnesotanness to bear, we hope. And that includes leveraging the organizing that existed, the institutions and strong civil society that we have, the unique business community in Minnesota that we have. I mean, this is really a institution of its place of Minnesota as much as of its practice. As an operating partner in this process, we know we are on an extremely tight timeline. It feels even tighter than our task before us today in this webinar, but we have just a few months to complete what is an essential part of building a record. And because of that, it's focused really on the most fragile part of people's memory, our actual memory. We won't be doing as much around archival work and things that could happen after the fact, as we will on taking statements or stories. We're counting on really robust participation from civil society, again, leveraging kind of the very organizing that we saw happening during Metro Surge. And we'll be talking both with individuals and in collective settings. A collective story or memory will be a welcome and essential part of this documentation process. We're in piloting right now, and we are in the process of nailing down all of the data collection details that are, of course, needed for where do we put things and how do you get them there. But once launched, we anticipate this to be a wide-scale story collection process that can be really accessed throughout the state of Minnesota. This is a statewide process. Despite Minneapolis getting nominated for the Nobel Prize, we know that this was something that was a statewide initiative. Or experience, and that the Operation Metro Surge just reflected the lack of understanding of Minnesota when it was named, I think. But once launched, we'll have this wide-scale story collection. It'll remain open throughout the tenure of the council. That means even as hearings or public meetings are underway or reports are being written, because people may want to give voice and document their memory at any point. That recognition of the truth of one's experience, the memory that we have, and making sure that that's documented before amnesia sets in will be incredibly important. And encourage people to not diminish our own stories. We all have something to say. We all have a perspective. And we also all may have seen things that could, when seen in a larger pattern, really illuminate what happened, where it happened, when it happened. So not to discount ourselves. At any point, it's easy to say, I'm not as important as the next person, but we all have a right to live our lives with dignity. That's what human rights demand. And the Advocates for Human Rights is just incredibly proud to be a partner in this critical step for our state.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We are going to now just move to questions. That way we can cover some of the really wonderful questions that are in the chat. The video, unfortunately, we could not get the sound to operate, but it will be posted on YouTube. So you will be able to watch it later. We will be putting that together and notifying audience members. Sarah also had to leave for some advocacy at the Minnesota Capitol. So this will be a conversation with both Michelle and Alexis. And well, maybe Sarah is here. Great. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
So good. I'm glad. So one of the questions in the chat, and that it really is the theme of the panel, has to do with what kinds of connections do we see between the Minnesota Truth Council and global issues of persecution and displacement. So tell us a bit more about how, to what extent, I know Advocates has extensive experience in this arena, to what extent are we bringing global experiences and knowledge to bear on the Minnesota experience?
Well, absolutely. This process didn't just spring out of nowhere. The governor's office, I think, Alexis, you can give us the backstory, but the governor's office has been very attuned to international practice and situating this process within that of this history since the 1970s of truth-telling and post-conflict type processes. They all vary widely, so there's no off-the-shelf model that can be just picked up and applied to any situation, but they all have, as they've tackled their specific instances, really focused on something that people very quickly identified as a top need, which is a narrative of truth and making sure that experiences are not diminished by simply being invisible or sidelined.
Great. Ms. Rorick, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. I would just say, like Michelle said, we did a great deal of outreach and research before we even launched and signed the executive order, including with Bernard from the UN, and gathering input from advocates and leaders in Minnesota, and then also in connection with Illinois' Accountability Commission, which is having their hearings today. If you are interested in this topic and want to hear more, as well as research into commissions that happened in Maine, in North Carolina, in Mississippi, in America's history, and thinking about how does this situate in America's history and in the ways in which we have shown up as a country and recorded the truth and the ways we haven't, and tried to bring all of that together, both internationally and domestically, and thinking about what is it going to look like for us and how can we make sure it reflects our needs moving forward.
Great.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Another theme running through some of the questions here is, to what extent will this Truth Council be effective in actually finding liability with the federal government? Are there levers, international levers that can be used to bring justice?
Well, clearly, this is not a process designed to either prosecute or engage in civil liability findings. And one of the things that we have in this instance that many communities don't have is we have functioning institutions of government. And so there will be referral processes to both the criminal investigations that are ongoing and to civil processes that are ongoing. There is a different setting in which we find ourselves, and we don't want to have a process like this step on or step in any of those other ongoing efforts that are so critical. This is an opportunity, of course, for us to potentially talk to people, and they may disclose facts that make it relevant for them to seek prosecution or speak to somebody in law enforcement. Those referrals can be made, as well as other harms. Lots of harms can't be addressed through the judicial process, but there may be healing or mental health issues. There might be, so many other ways of redress. So that is one thing. But as Special Rapporteur Dolores said, this is we don't know what the future holds, right? And documenting a pattern and practice of human rights violations puts that in the record and allows us to look back at it at times that we can't predict, and from vantage points we can't predict, and to put things in context or create accountability at later dates. We just need to be really clear. And I think as the initial discussions were going on around this, that we can't set up a process that promises something it can't deliver. This can deliver a chance for people to be heard, to have their truth recorded, and that is what it's designed to do.
So there's a very specific question in the chat, but really, I think, a very important one. How will victims that have been deported or exiled be included in this process? I don't know if Sarah, if you have any insights on the importance of those folks who are no longer here.
And I'm gonna take a first step, Michelle. I do think that when we talk about mixed status families, the disruption of a loved one being detained not only affects the detained person, but also their family. So the story of those detentions can be told through the lens of their families and their children. A lot of people who are going to be participating were involved in as victims or as legal observers. So the folks who are in detention are still with us through the histories of their families, their cousins, their daughters, sons, and other people who are still fighting for them to get out of detention or with them in some capacity through a habeas petition. So I think that we're going to have to look at this story from different perspectives. And when it comes to folks in detention, their families are going to be key to make sure that their voice and their experience reflects the record.
And unlike processes that took place, even a decade or more ago, uh, we have we're on Zoom today, right? We have ways of talking with people that we really didn't have at other times necessarily available to us. And the mandate of this process is really around people who were affected by Operation Metro Surge and Operation Paris, not people who are standing within the borders of Minnesota. So people who either were deported and shoved out of the United States, or just felt that Minnesota could no longer be their home and moved to another state, but who were affected, should be able to participate in the process. And we'll be thinking about how to include people. And that's during this sort of very quick pilot phase. Those are some of the questions we're wrestling with, but definitely we have an opportunity here at this moment of technology and time to capture things that we might not have been able to in even a decade ago.
So there's a really specific question in the chat that I'm going to or the Q&A that I'm going to read. It says, in 2025, the Minnesota legislature passed a bill to protect data from restorative practices from being utilized in civil and criminal courts. This better allows people who have caused serious harm to take accountability, admit guilt, apologize, and so on in a restorative space. Is the Truth Commission utilizing this unique Minnesotan law to invite accountability from ICE? And I think this is important because many Truth Commissions have moved towards restorative practices, and to what degree will this play a role?
We don't have, and Alexis, you all may have wrestled with this a little bit in the drafting of things, but we don't have the legal authority to let people off the hook for federal crimes. Even if the governor of Minnesota wanted to do that and have some sort of amnesty process, that's really outside the scope of authority. So it would have been irresponsible, I think, to make promises around those sorts of amnesty guarantees that just couldn't be kept. Again, we have a complicated federal system here, and we are still within the window in which victims may want to pursue legal remedies. So that really was outside of I think, outside of the scope of what could be afforded. And that means that there are limitations on who might come forward. There's also limitations on the evidentiary value of a statement naming a particular person when a story doesn't necessarily have a name attached to it. So we will be looking at all of those things, but that's why this is apart and unique from ongoing processes for accountability that we have in our criminal legal system and in our civil legal system.
So, Michelle, you named a lot of different potential, what I saw as potential challenges to the process. It's a very short timeline in particular for putting all of this together. Can each of you speak a little bit more to what are some of the potential shortcomings of this process, and are there ways to adjust for those moving forward? And maybe Alexis, you could begin because we haven't.
Sure. Yeah, happy to start. I mean, the timeline is definitely probably our biggest challenge. It is in part driven by some of the counsel and advice we received that we wanted to make sure that we are collecting the stories of harm and of unity as close to the point of impact as they occurred, so that they are still fresh in folks' memories, that we were able to engage with those individuals before they moved on or before society moved on. That does mean that the timeline is a bit truncated. But probably the other element is the governor's term ends in January, and we wanted to make sure to do everything we could in our power while we still were in office. our hope that it is that this work lives on, but we wanted to think about what is within our sphere of control, and driving this work forward in this timeline is something that we can do right now. So that's I think the ways in which we're mitigating it, honestly, is our incredible partnership with organizations like the Advocates for Human Rights and Unidos, and so many more, and the contributions that Minnesotans are already making to this Truth Council process. Michelle or Sarah?
Yeah. Oh, either way.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Yes, I think talking to folks who have worked in this sort of process in the past, I think one of the biggest challenges is people retaining their story and the amount of information that folks are going to be able to share across different cultures, communities, languages, and the process in itself being big and maybe at some points having shortcomings for people to feel fully comfortable to share. We are putting together a pretty short, easy to scale process that in itself might have shortcomings and might not feel as individualistic as some folks may. And another, I think it's very smart that we're relying on the organizing structure that's already alive and well in the Twin Cities because scaling might pose a challenge to the work that we're doing in terms of like how many stories we're able to collect. Therefore, we need to scale up, work fast, and rely on the networks that are already in existence and those relationships that are already in existence for folks to feel comfortable and to perhaps have a more individualized experience where they're sitting through the truth-telling exercise.
And I would just say all of the things that are shortcomings are just like every process has its limitations of time and space and place and capacity. And what this really is just a first opportunity to recognize that real harm was done and real strength was seen. And let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good and not do anything because it can't be open to all in all the ways that it should be. I was really inspired by the example of Brazil where the process moved and it changed and it had different owners and it has become something that's robust and real, and we can control that ourselves and just take this as a first step, not as the only step. And I think we're all committed to making sure that that is set up to be true.
All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to wrap it up, but with one question. For those that want to reach out and volunteer or share their expertise and work with you, are there channels for doing that?
Yes, I will put our collective email in the chat, but I have to check what it is because we have about 7 emails that all sound the same. So I'll do that and make sure that's in the chat here for reaching out to the advocates. And thanks.
Likewise, I will put mine in the chat as well. It's also on the Secretary of State's web page for the applicants. So if you can navigate there, or if I can drop that link in the chat, it's listed there as well. But I'm happy to be in touch with those interested.
Yes, and I'm going to share a couple emails for people to get involved. We have a first event launch at the parking lot of Mercado Central, May 1st on Friday. Folks are invited to come and get a sense of the work moving forward and lanes to get to be a part of the process. So I'm just gonna put that in the chat, and I'm just very grateful to be here with you all.
And so a huge thank you to all three of you for being here, and a reminder to the audience that we will be posting the video from Professor Neil Loyne. And now we will be moving on to our second panel. I'm pleased to pass the baton to Professor Dr. Carrie Booth Walling, Director of the Human Rights Program here at the University of Minnesota. She is an eminent scholar of human security and transitional justice with a specific interest in human rights advocacy. And she will be moderating the second panel on collecting and preserving testimony for accountability. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Christina, and all of the panelists. Thank you to the many people who have joined us online. This is the second panel in our two-part webinar series, Building a Truth Process in Minnesota, Lessons from Global Practice. I'm going to be joined by 3 Minnesota-based experts on collecting and preserving testimony for truth-seeking and for accountability. I'm going to introduce all 3 of them to you real briefly, and then we're going to go ahead and get our conversation started this afternoon. Edwin Torres de Santiago is founder and CEO of Voyagers Public Affairs, manager of the Immigration Defense Network, which is an engine of rapid response to violations of immigrant rights, and also a board member of COPAL, a member-based organization to increase quality of Latin families. Dr. Tricia Olson is professor and Stassen Chair of World Peace at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs and the Department of Political Science. She has expertise in human rights, business ethics, and transitional justice, including victims' access to remedy after human rights abuse. And we also are joined by Deepinder Singh Mayal, who is Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Minnesota. He previously served as Executive Director of the Binger Center for New Americans and Director of Refugee and Immigrant Program at the Advocates for Human Rights. So thank you to all 3 of you for joining us. And just a reminder for those of you who may have just logged in, we do want to involve you in the conversation, and so please use the Q&A function to put any questions you have along the way, and I will integrate those into the discussion today. But I want to go ahead and get us started. So Edwin, I want to start with you. Could you please tell us what you can about the ways in which information related to Operation Metro Surge and Operation Paris are being collected? And then maybe what are the limits and possibilities for information sharing with the Minnesota Truth Council that we were just hearing about?
Well, thank you and good afternoon. And thank you so much, Dr. Railing, for the work you're all doing in the University of Minnesota. I'm just going to take a little point of personal privilege and just say how honored and proud I am to also be a product of the University of Minnesota at the Humphrey School, where a few years ago, I became one of the first undocumented immigrants to pursue my PhD at the Humphrey School. So I just want to say thank you. And I see some of my professors here, so hope I do all of you proud. I come to you today not just as a representative of the Immigrant Defense Network, which you're going to hear from a lot of our steering committee members. I see ACLU. You just heard from Advocates for Human Rights. Well, I'll talk a little bit more about the Immigrant Defense Network in a little bit. But like I said, I'm not here just as a representative of the IDN, but as someone who has lived directly and have been impacted by a lot of these immigration enforcements for nearly 30 years. For about 25 of my 34 years of life, I lived without status. And my parents are still in limbo. Operation Metro Surge really had a devastating impact in our lives and that of so many of our communities here in the Twin Cities and in the entire state of Minnesota. So I want to start there, because when we talk about truth process, it can sound a little bit of abstract. It may sound maybe a little too academic. It may sound like something that happens far away and does not impact us. But the truth is, we're already in that process here in Minnesota. We've been in that process for months, actually. The question is it's not whether truth exists. The question is, what are we willing, who are we willing, and how are we willing to listen? Are we listening? Are we willing to preserve it? And are we willing to act on it? At the Immigrant Defense Network, that's what we've been at the forefront, at the intersections of all these questions. We have 9 legacy organizations, COPAL Minnesota, Advocates for Human Rights, ACLU, Minnesota Interfaith Coalition of Migration, Minnesota Aid, Ayala Leads, You have CW 1189, Land Stewardship Project, Main Street Alliance, and over 104 organizations that make up the Immigrant Defense Network. Across Minnesota, immigrant communities have been living through a reality that often goes unseen. This is not new for our communities. This is not the first time that my mom and dad have been in hiding, but it's been cruel the way that the enforcements have been undergoing in our state and what we've been seeing under this administration for the last year and a half. We've seen in Minnesota parents waking up, not knowing whether they're going to go to work, children's coming back from school, not knowing if they will see their mom and dad. We've seen incidents of our neighbors be attacked, kicked, broken skulls, broken bones, heart attacks, loss of eye vision, and some of our neighbors killed at the hands of ICE. These are not isolated incidents, as we've also known that well over 40 of our community members across the country have also died inside detention centers. These are patterns, and patterns are evidence. So for us at the Immigrant Defense Network, we have been documenting these violences and attacks on our human rights and our dignity. First, we have centered people most impacted, not as subjects, but as authors of truth. Too often, systems extract stories without giving power back. A true process will do the opposite. It ensures that people have agency over how their stories are told, when they're told, and what they're used for. Because testimony is not about just data, although we do have a lot of data. During Operation Metro Surge, we saw an average of 600 calls a day. We tracked every single one of those calls. We've also trained tens and thousands of constitutional observers who then received a secure link to upload data, whether it was the footage that they were capturing on the ground, or whether there was a voice memo of what they witnessed or what they saw, or it was an image of a picture of notes that they have taken. All of this was part of their training that we've done crisscrossing the entire upper Midwest. With the leadership and the advice of so many on this call. And second, we must treat testimony as infrastructure, not as an afterthought. So what do I mean by that? We've built systems for everything else. We built systems to track data, to enforce laws, to manage institutions. But when it comes to documenting harm, especially harm against marginalized communities, we relied on fragmented efforts. And this is why the leadership of so many, including ACLU and advocates, is so critical. Because individual organizers, under-resourced organizations, and moments of crisis may lead to really, really hard data. But that's what made the Immigrant Defense Network so different. Even in the midst of all the chaos that was going on, the cruelty by which our community was being enforced, we made sure that data was the most important thing that we can connect with our constitutional observers, with our neighbors, with everyone. So we would be able to connect with them, document their stories, and make sure that when the moment came, in this Truth Commission and others, that they can be ready to funnel those stories in a way that can actually create change. So for us at the Immigrant Defense Network, this process is deeply important. What we went through, what we experienced, the hurt, the pain, the loss has to be documented. It has to be expressed. It has to be shown. And together with a lot of our partners here, we're making sure that we are not a footprint in this ongoing attacks of our communities. For far too long, Minnesota has been in the middle of this country's heartbreak. From George Floyd to COVID, to the Operation Metro Surge, Operation Paris, and it continues. Many of us had the privilege of walking in Selma at the Jubilee back in March. As leaders and elders there reminded us, we were being anointed as we walked through the Ebnet Pettus Bridge across the Alabama River. We have to look back in our history. We have to make sure we all know that this is not a new thing. This has been going on for a long, long time. But enough is enough. We deserve dignity, love, respect, and a sense of stability. And that starts with documenting stories, expressing and showing those stories, and then identify actions by which we will take action to change the ecosystem and the systems so this never happens again, not just here in Minnesota, but across the entire country. So with that, Doctor, I will send it back to you.
Thank you so much, Edwin, and thank you for your willingness to really show us how deeply personal the storytelling is, and that what has happened here is part of a longer history and context that has been experienced by too many people in our country. I think you also have really shown us the sacred nature of testimony and how powerful that personal testimony can be. So thank you so much for your contribution. Trisha, I want to turn to you and invite you to share lessons that you've drawn from your own research, as well as your experience in collecting data, as well as testimony. What kinds of things might apply here in Minnesota or similar contexts across the United States?
Yeah, thank you so much, Carrie. Edwin, I arrived just a few years ago to Humphrey, but I guarantee you your professors are very proud, so well done. I just want to thank, first of all, Eric, Carrie, my co-panelists, and the organizers, those from the first panel, and everyone who is participating in this next effort in Minnesota and to seek truth. So as Carrie mentioned, I'm the professor and Stassen Chair here at Humphrey and in the Department of Political Science, and I also have the privilege of being the Director of Graduate Studies for our master's program in human rights, among other hats that I wear here at the university and elsewhere. I spent the early part of my career collecting data on transitional justice mechanisms, and so my role here today is really just to offer some thoughts on how data are collected and how they're used. I wanted to highlight, and it's related to data collection, some of the themes, though, from the first panel, which really kind of touched on this tension or perceived tension, perhaps, between truth versus accountability versus justice. I think sometimes in transitional justice, we also oscillate or kind of waver in between victim-oriented approaches and victim-oriented goals versus movement-oriented goals. And so when we think about the data that we actually collect, it's sort of important, I think, to have those conversations up front, because while the immediate goal is redressing harm, ideally providing, avenues for non-recurrence, there are long-term goals that we ultimately hope to address, right? To ensure that the systemic nature, which Edwin spoke about, right? That while we saw this, sort of monumental set of events in December, January, February, I guess, that this has been ongoing. It's been a lived experience for many, many people in Minnesota and around the country. And so sometimes I think, we sort of have to think about what truth commissions can do. And I know, Carrie, you have lots of thoughts on this too. So I hope you have a chance to chime in. But, on one hand, it's truth telling. Sometimes they're truth and reconciliation commissions. The hope, though, is that there's some repair, there's restoration, and possibilities to lead toward accountability efforts. And so those were themes that were sort of, alluded to in the first panel that I just wanted to kind of bring to the fore. But this panel is really about collecting and preserving testimony for accountability. And so I just have sort of 3 sets of comments, and I'm keeping a close eye on time. I was thinking that, the bad news, of course, is that there are many harms for which truth commissions and other transitional justice efforts have been established. But the good news is that this is, there's many examples from which to draw upon. And my research really was more about the effectiveness of transitional justice mechanisms more broadly. But it's interesting to kind of jump back into the literature and realize, the first sort of point I'd like to make is that the US, to the surprise of many, has a history of truth commissions. So Kelly Zavobgo, who's a faculty member at the College of William and Mary, has great research on truth commission efforts that the United States has engaged in since the 80s. So, Congress held a commission to study the federal policy of relocating people of Japanese ancestry and holding them in internment camps during World War II. But she has collected information on 20 past, present, and proposed official truth commissions, many of them that are about racial justice. And most of them, I should say, are at the subnational level. But across, I guess, kind of jumping more to the literature on global uses of truth commissions, I just want to highlight that there is a lot of variation across truth commissions. And so I just wanted to pull out a couple of kind of key pieces, some of which have already been mentioned, that really are associated with sort of more successful or more robust types of truth commissions. The first is that, it's really important to include a broad collection of those who were affected. And some of the speakers from the first panel indicated that the Truth Council here in Minnesota has that intention. Inclusivity is really strengthens these efforts. It helps the Truth Commission not be perceived as the story of one side or one particular narrative, but instead kind of highlighting the myriad of ways in which this event or sets of events have affected different segments of society. And that's a really, really important component of truth commissions. Another thing that I'll highlight is that, truth commissions or truth councils commissions also illustrate ways in which broader sets of community members can have constructive and forward-looking dialogue. And so while collecting information and collecting data on what happened is a key component, it's also, I think, in some ways, sort of modeling how we deal with this very difficult moment for other organizations, other units within the state and nationally. The leadership selection is often best when it's open and merit-based, as we've seen the Truth Council is going to do. But this notion of nonpartisan credibility is really important. And so, as I mentioned earlier, you sort of get that through broad civil society and involvement, and this is necessary to build trust across these different segments of society, that could involve business leaders, it could involve nonpartisan civic leaders, and even clergy or religious groups, in addition to kind of the other organizations that have been heavily involved in these processes. I did want to mention, and boy, time is flying. The next point is that, there's two kind of key themes that haven't been discussed as much, and I think those will be interesting to hopefully have some further reflection upon. One is digitization. So the fact that much of our evidence, people who have studied truth commissions in the past, there's just so much evidence, right? Much of which Edwin mentioned that there's already processes in terms of being collected. But as the Truth Council embarks on this as well, I'd just like to highlight two efforts. One is the Public International Law and Policy Group. They actually have an incredible kind of set of standards about the evidentiary requirements of digital information for transitional justice mechanisms. So it's often challenging because there's such a high volume of data that human rights documenters and transitional justice mechanisms must manage, but they really have sort of a clear set of policies that might be helpful. The other piece that I wanted to mention was the Berkeley Protocol on Digital Open Source Investigations. And this just provides standardized methods for collecting, verifying, and preserving publicly available digital evidence, like social media posts or videos, which could help in this process. The key piece that I want to highlight is that it's incredibly important to emphasize the chain of custody and authentication. And this protocol is written basically to help, in some ways, truth commissions by guarding against misinformation or disputes about evidence integrity. And so that's a really key point. The second thing that I wanted to note, and this is just sort of, I'll end with this last piece. I had more prepared, but we can leave that for the Q&A, is that one, you know, the Representative Sada, I think from Unidos, just mentioned that there are raids at a child, you know, at 20 plus childcare facilities today. So we are seeking, or the folks involved in the Truth Council are seeking to secure data in an insecure environment. And I just want to highlight that there are instances in which, and we can probably learn a lot from other organizations who are doing this in sort of the most extreme environments. So there have been a couple of organizations in Syria that have engaged in very sophisticated efforts in large-scale evidence collection with the intention of using it in truth processes or even accountability processes. So the two I just want to highlight are the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, which is a non-governmental organization dedicated to collecting evidence up to a criminal law standard for the purpose of furthering criminal justice. They've captured internal state records and have extensive witness testimony. The other organization that I wanted to highlight is the Syrian Justice and Accountability Center. They have massive volumes of open source content, but have done so in a way to ensure that they're stored, cataloged, and cross-referenced in a structured database. So, you know, on one hand, it's exciting to be being able to speak with folks about this process. On the other hand, like there's a lot to be garnered and learned from existing processes that are happening around the world. But just to end, I just want to just incredibly grateful to be among the individuals here today, and thanks everybody for their time and attention.
Thank you so much, Trisha, for sharing some resources and tools. And in doing so, you answered some of the questions in the chat from earlier as well. So really appreciate that. Deepinder, we want to turn to you now, and really just what would you like to share about collecting and collecting related to truth telling or accountability?
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this and this opportunity. I'm always humbled to talk about Minnesota and what happened here. And I always consider it a privilege to work for the ACLU of Minnesota and to stand and to lead here in Minnesota and to work with that legacy that they have left for all of us. So, you know, we know that what happened here in Minnesota was really a part of a broader pattern of unprecedented abuse of executive authority that we saw play out across the country. Of course, different in scale and scope here, but we did see things, immigration enforcement in LA, in Chicago, in Portland, and all of this was well documented in court after court after court. And it's important to think about some of these court cases because there are now several very large, very important court cases and class actions that do inform some of the question of testimony, do inform the question of taking declarations and some of these stories. In Minnesota, during Operation Metro Surge, we filed two cases, two class action lawsuits. One, tincture, which was focused on stopping the government from targeting protesters, observers, and journalists from violating those people's rights. And the second was Hussein, which was a case to end racial profiling and the groundless arrests of people not based on nothing more than their race or their perceived ethnicity in violation of the Fourth Amendment and federal law. There were other lawsuits across the country. There's lawsuits regarding the National Guard. There's similar lawsuits that the ACLU has been involved with in LA and in Chicago. And here in Minnesota, the Advocates for Human Rights was involved with an Access to Justice lawsuit with the Whipple building. There's also a lawsuit that we are involved with regarding administrative warrants. So I say all this just to give you a context of how much information is already coming to legal entities and how we already kind of manage some of this. You know, for us, managing anonymity and people's privacy is really important, right? So when we had our two cases that we stood up here, the First Amendment and the racial profiling cases, we set up two separate intake lines. And those intake lines for anyone who came and gave us their statement was considered part of a request for legal services and is therefore protected by attorney-client privilege, which means that if anybody asks for that information, the government in an investigation or via subpoena, we're going to say no. That also means that if anybody else asks for it, the press or a community member asks for that information, we're going to say no. But through that process, we took more than 800 intakes during that time. And in the Tincher case alone, we filed 148 separate declarations and submitted 30 videos. In the Hussein case, we filed 44 declarations. And in the Hussein case, some of the findings were really, really interesting and not surprising. The district court found in the Hussein case that 23 of our declarants were stopped and detained based solely on their race and ethnicity, and that 23 were stopped without reasonable suspicion of an immigration law violation, potentially a violation of the Fourth Amendment. And I say all this because, all of these declarations that we put in, we also got permission from the court to provide them in just an anonymous form with just initials. So even there, the declarations themselves are held and protecting people's confidentiality. This is going to be an issue in this process. This is going to be a question. There is fear. There is real fear. There is fear in the immigrant community. There is fear in the activist community. And in some ways, there is good reason to have fear. So this is something that, the ACLU takes very seriously. And it's something that I know that the people in the Truth Council are going to take seriously as well, and something that we're going to have to navigate moving forward. I will say, the last thing I want to just touch on is this question of accountability. And kind of what does accountability really look like in this moment? What does accountability look like for all the disruptions, for all the harm, for all the costs that we have endured? But there's another context here of what happened here in Minnesota, and what we saw during that era. This dramatic escalation of what was happening on the ground and in our homes, but also what was happening to our rights. What was happening to our constitutional separation of powers. We have seen lawsuits demanding our voter rolls. We saw potential deployment of the National Guard, potential invocation of the Insurrection Act. We saw the opening of criminal investigation into our governors and our mayors. We saw the resignation of the United States Attorney during the height of Operation Metro Surge. We saw the resignation of an additional 11 members from the U.S. Attorney's Office, including the head of the criminal division. We saw FBI infiltration of chat groups. We saw threats and targeting of advocates and activists, the following home, smashing windows, incessant texting. In that environment, that escalation is part of the context here, which makes it very different than other places. And on top of that, we saw the blatant lies and deception, the false claims coming from the government that really undermine this notion of accountability. So the question becomes, what does accountability look like in this moment? What does it really look like? What is accountability for the siege on our constitutional rights that we all experience? And the answer to that is that there's no single answer, right? It's not just one lawsuit. It's not just one criminal investigation or one criminal conviction. It's not one testimony, one piece of a Truth Council. It's a constellation of things. It's a whole body of different things. And there is no roadmap. Like Tricia said, this is not the end of, this is not a post-conflict truth and reconciliation moment. Right? We are in the middle of something. There is no roadmap, but we are writing it. Minnesota is writing it. And we should take pride in that, and to know that what has already been accomplished in the state is already part and will forever be part of that legacy. That's civil rights and civil liberties legacy in this country, and it's already changed what is going to happen afterwards. So I feel very humbled, very privileged, and really excited about this next step in the process with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepinder. And I think this point that you made at the end is really important to emphasize that there are going to be multiple forms of truth telling and accountability, and Edwin also made reference to that. So you also brought up, so the first question I want to share with you that also had come through some of the comments in the Q&A were these questions about anonymity and fear related to the truth-telling process that might happen here. Will there be additional processes and mechanisms beyond the Truth Council for people to participate in, to collect stories, and what's being done beyond the Truth Council in the community here? Edwin, you might want to maybe answer that, and Deepinder as well.
Of course. And I do apologize. It seems like my internet is a little spotty. So I hope I'm coming through clear. We are in the process to also work to build a way that people who went through Operation Metro Surge and have those stories can share them outside of the structure that might be the Minnesota Truth Commission. We know that we're going to be funneling our resources and our efforts there, but if there's so many people that are so afraid to even come forward. So that is part of the most important thing we need to do is work with community to ensure that as they're working through this, making decisions about telling their story, we've seen it already. We had multiple national and international circles come in and have full day-on discussions. Some of that will continue. Some of those opportunities for full day discussions will continue, but right now we are focused on how do we work with the Minnesota Truth Commission, and as we continue doing that, create spaces where people can continue sharing their stories in a way that makes them feel most comfortable. So and I hope my internet is not being spotty, but if it is, I apologize.
We got you. Thank you, Edwin. Deepinder, is there anything you would add or any advice to give to people who've been deeply impacted and aren't certain how they want to participate? What should they do to document and preserve their own experiences?
I think that the Truth Council is going to develop ways to try and protect anonymity. So I would, suggest people to look at what those protocols are when we develop them and put them out and see if people feel comfortable to tell their story in a way that, we can protect some of that. I mean, the other ways to do it, again, there's no roadmap here, this is, talking to people, telling your story, writing your stories, art, culture, music, your people, your groups, find your people, it's hard. It's hard to figure out what to do with this trauma, to do with this and process it. I think a lot of people are dealing with that right now. But just asking that question means that, you're probably on the tip of doing something. I mean, if you come up with a great idea, please let us know, because I think other people want to hear it too.
There are two related themes that have come up in the Q&A. One is how to protect the process from the appearance of political influence. And then the second, which is a little connected but slightly different, is that there are people in Minnesota and elsewhere who believe that the ICE actions were justified. So how do you explain this Truth Council to them? So kind of a two-part question there, political influence and those who maybe supported the actions that have happened.
Sure. So, I mean, uh, I think for the, and I'll let other people jump in too here, but part of the kind of impartiality here is using the kind of the standard tried and true practices for documenting this. This is a practice that has been used through human rights mechanisms across the world for decades now. And there is a way to do this that ensures credibility and transparency. And I think the more that the council sticks to those processes and protocols and lets the truth shine, the more credibility and efficacy it has. That's really the most powerful thing that you can do, is stick to those protocols.
Trisha, any
Yeah, I was
final
going to say it looks like perhaps we lost Edwin, so if he hops back on, I'm happy to cede time. But I would just say it's this idea of inclusivity. So I think it's really one of the key challenges right now in this moment is bringing in a variety of voices. And I don't necessarily mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there, Operation Metro Surge and Paris affected multiple segments of society in different ways. And for the Truth Council to both not become political and for it to speak to folks who perhaps supported what ICE was doing, you need the variety of those stories such that you're able to reach different audiences. And so I think that is not to say that some stories will push out others, but I just think that inclusivity is incredibly important. The other piece that I would say is that hopefully the Truth Council is thinking really carefully about what they're going to disseminate, how they're going to disseminate it, what's going to be in the report. I'm confident that there are ways to ensure that people who participate remain anonymous, but are they going to name names of perpetrators of violence? And what will that look like? And so I think hopefully the Truth Council is thinking really carefully about, I saw a question in the chat if it would be translated to other languages. I sure hope so. And so, just thinking about how that information is going to be disseminated. And often I think, I'll just close with this, sometimes people think about truth commissions as creating like a common narrative. I don't know that that's a realistic goal in this media infrastructure that we have today. And so I suppose my hope for it would be that it creates a number of narratives that are about truth and justice and reconciliation and accountability that speak to different audiences that we know exist. That may be the best we could hope for.
Thank you, Trisha, for those thoughts. We have just struck the time of 1:30, and so we're going to close in just a moment. Just before we close, I do want to go ahead and give Edwin and Deepinder if they have any final closing comment they want to make, and then I will go ahead and close out with some additional information for our guests.
I don't have anything to add. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. And that's it.
Same. I just want to say thank you, and if I can leave you with one other thing is, I am extremely proud of our state. Extremely, extremely proud of the way people came together, the way that we decided to protect each other, and that we chose love. Let's carry those things as we move forward in this next phase of documenting and ensuring that what we went through doesn't just stay within our ecosystem, but to everyone's point here, gets spread and that more and more people. The question about translating is so important because my own mother was like, well, I understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, we will figure it out. And I think that's what most of us are in this process. We'll figure it out together. But thank you all for making time, and thank you all for hearing from us.
Yeah. Well, thank you all three of these panelists, as well as the panelists earlier. All of you, as well as these members of our community, have just really shown how much human rights change and the pursuit of justice and truth requires that we act with our hands, but also with our heads and our heart. And I love the way that all of you are coming with your whole selves to serve our community. Want to also give a special thanks to Eric Schwartz, the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, for organizing, and all of the special guests, our technical folks who've kept us on track and everything working today. What a gift to have that kind of support. We also really want to thank all of our community partners and all the panelists. And again, this community, what a honor and privilege to be a part of it. And thank you all for the work that you continue to do here in Minnesota and around the country in the pursuit of truth, justice, and human rights. So thank you all. We were going to post this recording as well as our video from Professor Nealon as well. And so you'll be getting that later. Thank you all so very much.
Good evening from Marrakesh, from Morocco. I'm really pleased to be joining you remotely, and my apologies that the poorness of the internet quality meant that I'm not able to join the meeting live. It's my great pleasure to have a chance to speak about the discussion today, which is the focus on truth processes. And in making some remarks, I welcome the governor's initiative. It is an important domestication of the concept and practice of transitional justice. And of course, that practice of transitional justice is relatively new in international law. We have seen it emerge in post-authoritarian and post-conflict settings. And focus on transitional justice has allowed us, in places where we don't have recourse to regular or normal legal procedures for a variety of reasons, to address the rights and needs of victims and survivors of serious human rights violations. So as a long-term practitioner of transitional justice in Northern Ireland and across the globe, and currently in my role as Commissioner on the UN Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic, my remarks are really focused on best practice and lessons learned, things that might inform the Governor's Truth Council as they move forward, and as this planning phase thinks about how best to undertake this task in Minnesota. Let me start by saying transitional justice, as I've said before, comes from a particular place. It comes from post-authoritarian and post-conflict settings. And that origin story matters because, of course, the tools that we have generally been applied in states where there is no functional rule of law system, or those tools are so degraded as to be either inoperable, like in Rwanda, when we had 7 judges left at the end of a genocide, or in places like Bosnia and Herzegovina, where in fact, the courthouses had been bombed and there was no infrastructure of justice because it had been largely maimed and challenged by the war. Or in a place like South Africa, where the legal system, which was an apartheid legal system, was a system that in fact had preferenced one racial group, whites, over another, blacks, and meant that actually the quality of justice, or the capacity of that system to do justice equally to all victims, was about 0. So transitional justice processes in democracies are rare. We've seen them in a couple of places like Australia and Canada to deal with particular scandals to do with, for example, clerical abuse or sustained institutional violations that appear to be beyond the scope of the regular legal system. But the reason I emphasize the origin story and why it's important that the governor's office and those thinking about this truth process think carefully is you can't simply transpose the tools that have been used in places like South Africa, Rwanda, Bosnia and Herzegovina to the great state of Minnesota. Some work will need to be done to ensure that the kind of instrumentality of transitional justice takes account that yes, we have a problematic and sometimes flawed judicial and legal process in the United States, but it's not degraded. It doesn't cease to exist anymore. So a really key and important thing of this Truth Council is to think about how it will work in tandem with the existing other parts of the legal system in the United States that are functional, and that doesn't operate to hinder those processes, that it is in fact a joined up kind of overall justice. The second comment I would focus on is the importance of local contextual realities to truth processes. And the title of the governor's proposed body is the Truth Council. And I have to say, truth in the singular always makes me a little bit nervous. I don't think there are singular truths. I come from a place, Northern Ireland, that experienced a conflict for over 30 years. Truth there wasn't singular. There were very many truths in the plural. Some of them didn't sit comfortably with one another. So a truth council has to be tolerant and open enough to recognize that there may be a multitude of stories and a multitude of outcomes, not a singular authorized truth in the singular. And I think that's not just a phonetic distinction, it's an important distinction in terms of the openness of the process and what it's prepared to hear. And in that context, the local is critical. Transitional justice processes that work well are local. They're embedded in the local. Often they're hyper-local. They're local because they understand what happened in a particular place, a society, a time, but it's contextualized by the totality of, in particular, history of that space. And so, of course, while we have a Truth Council that's focused on Operation Metro Surge, that's very important, that operation doesn't emerge in a vacuum. And it would be, I think, a strategic mistake to create such a narrow funnel of discussion around one particular operation or related sets of operations and fail to understand broader spaces in which communities who have been targeted and individuals by this particular operation have a prior history of a lack of representation or space in the justice system more broadly. The fourth comment I want to make is about transitional justice as a holistic space. And I think that's really important. Holistic transitional justice means that we have to look at the totality of harms. It means we have to make clear decisions about when we start. Truth commissions in general have a start date and an end date, this date to that date. And one of the problems of that, as my own scholarship has looked at in over many years, is that that can actually leave out a whole set of things that are entirely relevant to what happened in that kind of quarterized space. So I think that the start point, the timelines are really important. And the other reason why the timelines are really important is the end point of a transitional justice process. And one of the things we've learned along the way is that short, rushed truth processes that sort of push for quick resolution often don't work so well. Now, I understand why people sometimes want those really quick kind of American-style hamburgers. Things come out and go quickly, but actually, sometimes truth or truths need to cook. And my experience, for example, working on issues of gender in the South African Truth and Reconciliation process, was that one of the things we learned was that when we had a truth process that was shortened, that actually there were very many groups who didn't come forward, that their place or their experience meant that it was going to take a while before they would actually speak their truths in the plural in public space. So the length of time and the process matters enormously to the quality of the exercise. Again, thinking about holistic transitional justice, we need to think about the terms of reference for this Truth Council that's been established. I often argue that we tend to have very narrow sights. The early transitional mechanisms only focused on harms to the body. They were concerned, and obviously so, about torture, violations of the right to life, arbitrary detention. Those are all super important things. But actually, if we think through a universal human rights perspective, we actually need an integration of economic, social, cultural, political rights. They all have to be part of the picture. And it has seemed very obvious to me from the beginning that part of the story that we have to tell in Minnesota is a story about business. It's a story about work. It's a story about education. It's a story about health. These are socioeconomic rights protected by the Economic and Social Rights Covenant. And to lose those, I think, would be an enormous takeaway from holistic transitional justice. When we think about transitional justice, we think about the powers of commissions, and this body has to have the capacity to call evidence, to call individuals, to have access to public files. Truth sounds great, but if you don't have the capacity to excavate the truth legally, then there's a lot you cannot do. Holistic transitional justice means that you have commissioners who are representative, that they represent the community in a meaningful way, but also that they're experts, that they can give you the kind of legal process that's needed to, in fact, have a truth that responds to both the legal question and its integration into broader legal processes. And finally, I would stress that a truth process has to support victims. There is no point setting up a truth council that hasn't already built in meaningful support for victims. And we have great organizations in the Twin Cities that does that. Advocates, of course, the Center for Victims of Torture. These bodies, CVT has been doing this work across the world for decades. So again, not to make sure that we're giving our own citizens and communities the same benefits of access to psychological support, to ensure that they're not secondarily harmed by this process is really important. Let me close by saying two more things. One is that truth processes, to be effective, have to be nonpartisan. It doesn't work to have one-sided truth. It doesn't work to have truth look like it's the prosecution of one truth against one party or one particular group of people. The whole point of a truth process in international law is one that brings in, not that excludes out. So I think this commission or this council will have to do a lot of work to ensure that it's inclusive, that it is folding in, that it is not partisan, that it can invite in all kinds of questions and individuals. And that way it can be transformative. Let me close by saying that it is really important that truth process is intersectional, and that in particular it includes the voices of women, that it is gendered. That matters from who's on the commission to who's on the staff, to who gets training, to what the terms of reference are. Are we going to look at the totality of rights violations, not just a narrow subset? Are we going to make sure we listen to rural voices and not just urban Minnesotans? It's really easy to drown out those voices outside the Twin Cities. Super important that they are heard. And more important, that we protect victims and survivors, that we recognize that those individuals are often exhausted. By the time we've got around to creating a truth process, they have already been through so much. Are they ready to be through another process? For many victims in truth processes across the globe, the most important thing to them is livelihood. It's about getting on with their lives. It's about having a job. It may not be telling their story. For some, it might be, but not all. And I think we have to make sure that we can tell an inclusive story, one that is both comfortable and uncomfortable. The whole point of a truth-telling process is that it's not a blaming exercise. And it's a resilience exercise. It's an exercise in accountability, but it's not a one-stop shop, and it is a road, not a destination. Many thanks, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the remarks. And again, really sorry that I can't be with you this evening. Thank you.